Welcome to From the White Pill Box, the podcast where we stomp on statism and find the white pills along the road to a stateless society. I'm your host, Mark Maresca. I'm the author of the Substack articles of the same name, From the White Pill Box, content specifically for the already red-pilled, libertarians, voluntarists, anarchists, people who've overcome the myth of statism or are close to it. It's easy for us to be black-pilled, to believe evil will win. That's where the white pill box comes in. There are real-world reasons to have hope. Let's get going. Greetings, all. Thank you so much for listening today. This episode will be part 11 of my series on the myth of authority. To get a full picture of the content so far, I suggest you review the previous episodes, which I've linked to. Today, we're going to switch gears. We've been discussing the myth of authority, and we've taken deep dives into it. What the myth is, why it's so potent, its psychology, such as how it infects our thinking, how it creates a false self, the myth's relationship to the state as the root cause of the state. We've reviewed the myth's relative absence from libertarian strategy, which explains why we've had meager progress for half-century. And we've talked about how all this can be useful in refining libertarian strategy, how we can be more direct in messaging so that we can strike at the myth, the root of statism. We reviewed tips and guidelines for doing that, and I've even taken some good digs at politics, arguably the worst, most indirect way of making progress. We've found some decent white pills so far, but mostly we've focused on learning from the past and improving how we communicate. I've wanted us to be better armed to understand the challenges we face to better strategize. So now I'd like to uncover some of the white pills that get revealed now that we better understand the myth of authority and its important role in the big picture. We'll do that by exploring the fascinating topic of the transition to a free society. Now, admittedly, how that will look is highly speculative, but if we apply what we've learned about the psychology of the myth of authority, our analysis will look less speculative and more plausible. So strap in, because this next part of the series is going to be a fun ride. There's so much to say about the transition that I'll be splitting it up into several episodes. Today, we'll start off with an overview. I'll define what we mean by the transition. This tends to be understood by libertarians very vaguely, so we'll try to pin this down. I'll explain how to think about the when of the transition, gauging when it starts and when it ends. Through all this, I'll review some other common libertarian misconceptions about it. And finally, I'll talk about the state. We'll need to get real clear about what we mean by that in the context of the transition. Okay, let's define the transition. We intuitively understand what it means. We all know statism is worldwide and goes back like forever. And there's some future point where there are no more states, a free society. Somewhere in between statism and a free society is a transition period. And it's right there that most libertarians stop. The concept of the transition just floats out there as some vague abstract thing happening over an undefined time period. So let's do better. Our big takeaway from this series is that the myth of authority is the root of statism. This necessarily means the myth of authority plays a role in the state existing and the state going away, which means it plays a role in the transition. And there we have it. The events and dynamics of the transition will be directly related to the status of the myth of authority. The myth is the measuring stick to gauge the progress of the transition. Let's split that clean division of history into 3 parts: before transition, during actual transition, and after transition. Or, put another way, period 1, full statism. Period 2, transition. Period 3, fully free society. And to really hammer it home, let's describe them in terms of the myth. Period 1, full belief in the myth of authority. Period 2, the dissolving of the myth. Period 3, no myth. Notice how using the myth elegantly simplifies it. Now we can see it. Period 1 is all of recorded history, solid myth straight through. There's no change in the dominance of the myth. It's 100% right up to the point where the myth starts to get questioned. Then it's period 2, which is about the myth getting questioned. More and more and more. It's a decline in the myth's dominance. That is to say, a change. That's why it's a transition. This period 2 ends when the myth is basically gone. And this starts period 3, when there is no myth anymore. No more transition. We're permanently 100% myth-free. And of course, with no myth, no state. So to help us keep things clear, think of the transition as this shift in the degree of the myth of authority. Yes, a lot of outward effects will be taking place as a result of this. Sure, this is where statists will be reacting to the change. Freedom thinkers will be thinking and writing about it. Free communities will be getting established. State offices will be shrinking. We'll cover that, but please keep focused on the root, the key factor, the changing level of the myth of authority. Okay, that's what I mean by the transition. Next, let's discuss the when, a very misunderstood topic. Most libertarians think of the transition as, well, in the future, something that'll start someday. But they only assume that because they think of the transition in terms of the state, as if it's strictly a period of the dismantling of the state. They think of the effect, not the cause, the myth of authority. So right there, we can see one of the best white pills you could want. As I said, the transition's primary characteristic will be the erosion of the myth of authority. When that starts, the transition starts. Well, newsflash, the myth of authority has started to erode. You heard me right. We're in it. The transition has started. Now, because I know most of you will probably look at that assertion skeptically, I want to support it. Of course, in a way, it's fairly evident. If the transition is a period in which the myth is getting seriously questioned, it's pretty undeniable the myth is being questioned right now. But let me also support it with a bit of history. About half a century ago is when the libertarian anarcho-capitalist movement started getting its legs. This marks the first time some real intellectual power took on the moral legitimacy of political authority. Of course, you can identify earlier thinkers and movements that came close. Lysander Spooner nailed a lot of this. The anarchist movement of the late 1800s and early 1900s had some of it right, but it wasn't cohesive yet, and its scholarly foundation had not matured yet. And another problem, communication was still hampered. It was limited to newspapers, magazines, and pamphlets, all very slow ways of spreading ideas. Electronic mass communications followed, which could have been promising, except that the state jumped in to monopolize the radio and TV airwaves, issuing licenses and severely limiting content. This incentivized the big stations to become propagandists for the state. Around the 1960s and 70s was when the scholarly work in libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism exploded. And here we see the first solid philosophical grounding for a free society, the first clear justifications about why the state is inherently illegitimate. It wasn't called that, but the myth of authority was being exposed. This root insight was the essence of the aha moment for most people. It could take many forms, but the general common thread was waking up to realize that political rulers should not exist. It's at this general time, somewhere in the 60s or 70s, that marks the start of the transition. I call it the start because it's basically when the cat's out of the bag. To those who cleared their fog of indoctrination, political authority was now understood as morally illegitimate, and you can't unsee that. It's like the first awareness that slavery is wrong. You don't go back. Or like realizing Santa isn't real. You don't go back. Here, we saw three key pieces of knowledge coming together. One, it made sense intuitively, meaning it struck a chord with our general sense of human fairness. Two, it now had scholarly backing by deep thinkers. And three, it made practical sense. The free market could do anything the state could, and better and cheaper. So, unlike the occasional starts and stops before then, the 60s and 70s was the first time all those elements came together. Okay, cat out of the bag. As more people started to see it, it was less likely the ideas would die off. Sure, they were spreading slowly, but they were spreading now because they were so compelling. This is why I mark off this period as the start of the transition. Now, in the last couple of decades, the internet has matured, and since then, these ideas have spread much faster than before that. We're way past the point where the state's control over the news means anything. Thanks to the internet, communications is decentralized, and getting more so every year. It's wonderful, of course, that anarchist content is part of that, but even more important is that state propaganda is getting outcompeted by all content, anarchist or not. Remember that propaganda is the essential tool the state needs to stay afloat, to keep the myth intact. That tool is quickly falling apart. So even if you might see the early decades of this movement as too slow to count as the start of the transition, the internet's influence makes it a slam dunk that at least now we can say for sure the transition is underway. There's no going back. The fog of the myth of authority is obviously being challenged. True, very slowly, but it is clearing. And for anyone genuinely red-pilled, it is not coming back. So yes, I'm happy to report the transition is underway. So to keep it clear in our heads, let's summarize these three periods of history defined by the myth of authority. Along with it, let's use an analogy, an hourglass. The sand inside is the myth of authority, all of it sitting in one of the glass bulbs. Period 1 is basically all of human history right up to the start of the transition. The hourglass is just laying there on its side. The sand sits there, nice and stable, unchanging. That whole period 1 was stable for the myth, which of course made it stable for statism. The myth of authority trapped the minds of everyone. They all accepted political rulers as legitimate. Or, if there were rare exceptions, they had no voice, nothing to sustain them. And yes, there were stateless societies, but they still retained the myth in some form. They didn't have all those three pieces: intuitive sense of not wanting rulers, scholarly grounding, and practical free market alternatives. They were not inoculated against statism. That's all period 1. Next, the transition begins. The myth of authority starts to get challenged. We are in period 2. The hourglass has been stood up. The sand starts to trickle down, grindingly slow, but it's happening. As time passes, more of the sand empties out from the top. That's the myth of authority. As the myth crumbles, statism crumbles in kind, and stateless societies emerge. Of course, no one can predict how long the transition will take, how long period 2 lasts. But the myth of authority will eventually run its course, be dead and buried, and with that, no more states. At that point, the transition is over. The hourglass sand will have emptied out to the bottom. No more sand left to fall. Period 3 now, where things are stable. There's no change happening, no more myth of authority, no more states. Now, all that leads to something interesting. We happen to live in the one time when things are in flux, period 2. It's not the vast span of thousands of years of period 1, when the myth of authority was bulletproof, and it's not the extended future of period 3, when the myth of authority will be impossible. We occupied the unique period of transition, and it is definitely a period of change, just like the early to mid-1800s was a period of change with slavery. Before that, most of the world thought it was okay. During the change, the notion was shifting, losing favor. After that, people stopped believing in slavery. But during that transition, there was definitely change happening. Which brings us to the next topic, the general view that libertarians have of this period of change, the transition, at least what they assume it'll be like, without always really thinking it through. Unfortunately, we tend to have rather simplistic versions. One of these assumptions is that there will be more or less some visible order to the process, as if things will change in a series of interconnected, recognizable events, almost like the storyline of a suspense movie, where obvious things happen that totally get your attention and wrap up by the end. Closely related to this is the assumption that the process will somehow be planned. There'll be, quote, someone at the top, unquote, decreeing it's time to transition now. Some people fantasize the Libertarian Party doing this, or they imagine the U.S. Congress suddenly saying, we woke up now, so let's start the process of dismantling the state. Or maybe others imagine some sort of revolutionary takeover. Notice the common mistake. It's always a physical takeover or a physical dismantling. It's never psychological. It's the same error I've been talking about since the start of this series. They focused on the outward apparatus of the state, not the myth of authority. So, to reiterate once again, the state will be pervasive as long as the myth is pervasive. This means that whatever it is that the transition will look like, its primary characteristic will be the erosion of the myth of authority. When that starts, the transition starts. When the myth is dead, the transition is over. The outward effects of this will be the state itself eroding and eventually disappearing. Yes, that will be visible. But the state is and will always be a downstream symptom of the myth. So again, the myth is the centerpiece of the transition. So it's far more likely to be an organic change, driven by psychological changes, changes in the pervasiveness of the myth of authority, leading to human actions and responses. They'll work their way through the population more or less randomly. It's not as if the myth will be overcome at some ground zero place and ripple out from that physical location to the people in that area. That's ridiculous. The people who are overcoming the myth will be randomly located, just as they are now, which means the outward effects of that change will be dispersed. Eventually, here and there, various governments will start to reduce or give up particular functions. Eventually, they'll close them or they'll get replaced by private alternatives. But even this is almost too black and white to describe it, since the decline of the myth will play out in a slow, organic way. Those outward declines of the state will roll through society pretty much naturally without much notice. Now, let's discuss an unfortunately common assumption that the transition will bring expressions of force or even violence, like mass riots, civil war, race wars, economic calamity, who knows what, and the state cracking down in some brutal, fascist-like takeover. This view is very understandable. When you have a bad situation and something is now changing about it, there is risk of extreme reactions. A cult may be a stable place until someone tries to escape and then the fangs come out. Or a woman in an abusive relationship might, sadly, see it as stable because when she thinks about changing it, getting the hell out, she's fearful of how badly the guy will react, that his fangs will come out. We can see how this can likewise happen in the transition to a free society. It is a period of change, and people in the state could potentially act desperately. Folks, we need to hope that that won't be the story, because I assure you, the end result of that will not be a peaceful, stateless society respecting the non-aggression principle. If freedom advocates start talking about a show of force, I might remind you that the state holds a monopoly on violence. At least at this early stage of the transition, don't kid yourself. They will be prepared to use force to squash any obvious resistance. I've mentioned this before, and I'll repeat it. Yes, The state is provably quite capable of using authoritarian violence, and they've proved to be irresponsible and reckless. That's why I've used the expression, the race. On the one side, a slow, organic, peaceful transition to a free society, versus every step of that race, the possibility the state goes so far overboard it sends us back to the Stone Age or makes us extinct altogether. The race is about which will happen first. That outcome is uncertain. We should all be on team peaceful transition. If you're hoping for or even working for direct conflict with the state in order to get us to a free society, you are not on that team. But I don't think that's how it'll play out. It will be very slow, mostly quiet and invisible. I'll get more into that later, but overall I'll say this. The root problem is psychological, a deeply embedded myth that messes with the human mind and results in the state. The transition will be all about the clearing of that fog. Not 1 in 1,000 will understand what's happening. Heck, right now, it seems, not 1 in 1,000 nerdy libertarians and anarchists seem to appreciate the role of the myth of authority. Somehow, I don't think low IQ, self-centered politicians and bureaucrats are going to see it happening. Instead, the slow psychological transition will make it be much more emergent. It should happen in an organically healthy way. It's the same way the myth probably emerged in the first place, intruding more and more into people's minds, but hardly noticeable in the short run. The myth has now started to dissolve, and we can say it's quiet and unintrusive to most people. Believe me, that's a good thing. For this transition, the less dramatic, the better. And that leads to the final libertarian assumption about the transition. It's about the pace of progress. I mentioned just now a slow and steady transition, and I think libertarians sometimes interpret this to mean the transition will always be that way, a linear progress. Meaning, say, if X many people get red-pilled this year, the same amount will next year, and so on. They conclude, at this pace, it'll take forever. It's like using my hourglass analogy and taking it literally. The sand falls at the same pace all the way. So why do you think they assume the same slow pace during the transition? I suppose it's natural. We're impatient for any goal to be reached quickly. We see the slow start and the slow pace now and extrapolate that. That's why we'll say the transition will take 1,000 years, 500 years, whatever. We assume the slow start defines the future pace. But notice, what happens in the real world? Well, reality just doesn't work in straight lines. You don't get over your fever in a straight line. It goes on for a while, then it breaks. An unstable mountainside may first show bits of dirt and rocks slipping, then suddenly the whole side comes down. Social change is like that too. Things can start slow, then change really fast. Examples. The American colonies' secession from England happened over not much more than 10 years. Slavery ended over a period of decades. The Soviet Union fell in a few years, arguably less. Yes, the forces that build up to events like these take time. They sort of build the foundation. And that part of the process can be frustratingly slow. And that's where we are now. But then there's a point where things change fast. So it's more like those graphs where the line starts off pretty straight left to right, but sloping up just a little bit. Then at some point, the slope starts to curve up more, then more, until it's more vertical than it is horizontal. The curve changes exponentially. That's more descriptive of social change. Given our understanding of the myth of authority and its psychology, I'll be showing you in these episodes why that's far more likely in the transition, far more realistic. That's all part of what I hope I can persuade you about, that the transition will be natural, organic, bottom-up, practically invisible. And you know, every one of those is true exactly right now, aren't they? People are getting over the myth naturally, in an organic way, extremely decentralized, and barely noticeable. And I also hope to persuade you the transition will be tangibly evident sooner than we might have thought. No, not tomorrow or next year, but not 100 years either. Okay, I'm going to end with how we should think about the state in the context of the transition. I'll frequently be using the standard phrase, the state, but there's actually a lot packed into that, and I'll have to break things down. Today, I'll start with the general term, the state, and next time I'll break things down from there. Okay, the general term, the state. By this I mean the whole apparatus of statism, of government, through and through, top to bottom, across whatever territory we happen to mean. The term means the thing as a whole. Also, in addition to that, I even include the state's henchmen, like corporate media, academia, banking, who use their own influence to push the propaganda of statism. They are all part of the apparatus I call the state. So now let's ask, how many human beings comprise the state? Well, worldwide, the best estimate is 15 to 20% of people work for the state in some capacity. But since I'll be working with United States figures, it's actually about 9% who work for government at all levels, federal, state, county, whatever. We're talking the whole mess. Politicians, bureaucrats, all law enforcement groups, all administrators, training, accountants, legal, maintenance, inventory, plumbing, transportation, cooking, cleaning. The list goes on. If we count all of them, it's about 9% of all adults. There are about 260 million adults in the United States, so that's about 24 million people. So when I say the state, this would refer to those 24 million people. Next time, we'll break this down further. Meantime, though, I'd like you to ponder the numbers. There are about 335 million people in the United States, counting children. Spend some time thinking about it. How 24 million compares to 335 million. By strict math, those in the state are outnumbered 13 to 1. That's one person in the state for every 13 people not in the state. One person ruling over 13. Something to think about, right? Well, then I'll tease you with this. The ratio is even more dramatic than that. And with that little tidbit, I'll end things for today. We've only scratched the surface of the transition, and we already have some white pills, with more to come. Until then, take care, and see you next time. Many thanks to Substack for hosting my podcast and my articles. And thanks especially to you for listening. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.